Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Later this fall, voters across Ontario will go to the polls to elect municipal councillors and mayors. These officials will become the first level of representation for residents for the next 4 years. An important responsibility, to be sure. As we read about or talk with those individuals seeking our support, I thought we might go back a few years and profile someone who first ran for Kingston City Council back in 1980, and 8 years later became the first woman to wear the chain of office as mayor of this city. Why did she get into politics? What did she consider one of her most important accomplishments as mayor? And what has she been doing since she left politics? All of this and more in our conversation with Helen Cooper, recorded in March of 2022. It has been a long time since you and I sat down and had a chat.
Very long time.
So I thought when I saw your name popping up in a list somewhere, I said, I should get a hold of Helen and see if we can sit down and talk about some of the things you've done since you left politics. And for the benefit of those listening, go back to the beginning and talk about how you got to where you are now. Okay with you?
Okay.
All right. This first section I'm going to call Helen Does a Little Traveling version 1.0. And this goes back to the beginning. You were born in Australia.
Yes, I was, of an Australian father and a Canadian mother.
And then you moved to Kingston at some point when you were a kid.
Yes, my father got a job with the Kingston Week Standard because he'd worked for a newspaper in Australia. And so I was very young. I have no siblings. My father and mother moved to Kingston and lived here quite happily ever after.
And you went to KCVI and went to Queen's.
That's right.
And you, I think, did a little bit of work as a chemist originally after you left Queen's.
Well, I graduated from Queen's with a degree in chemistry and mathematics, but I think by the time I graduated, I wasn't interested in graduate work. Several of my colleagues were, and were very successful at it. But I wanted to get out into the world instead. So I got a job with Procter & Gamble in Hamilton and on product development. And the development of the product, in my case, was Duncan Hines banana cake mix.
Really?
And several of my friends have always teased me about it and said my career was all downhill from there.
You wouldn't associate a chemist working on a cake mix, at least in my mind, but...
Well, it tells you something about about processed food, doesn't it? Actually, a cake is a relatively complicated chemical formula. Even a cake that hasn't got artificial ingredients in it.
So at some particular point, you decided to move on to something else, and you got involved with QSO. And I don't know how many people know what QSO is, so why don't you give us a little idea of what the organization does?
Yes, it still exists, and QSO today is not what it was in 1969. It stands for Canadian University Service Overseas, and in the 60s, it started in the early 60s. It was a well-meaning attempt to assist the developing world. My original intention was to apply to teach chemistry in India. I think I was influenced by the phase that the Beatles were going through at the time and finding their whatever in the middle of India. I applied through McMaster because I was working at Procter & Gamble in Hamilton, and the person who ran the office there was able to persuade me very easily that I didn't want to go to India because India didn't really need chemistry teachers. And he told me there was a job in East Africa where he had worked at one time and advised me that I would likely enjoy being there very much, and he was right.
So you went to Tanzania.
So I didn't know initially which Eastern African country I would be in, but over time found more and more about the posting. And I was posted to a school on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, which I would suggest is as close to paradise as anywhere in the world. And Tanzania was originally German East Africa. Kenya was British East Africa. So the schools tended to be all up the mountain, where the German, either Lutheran or Catholic missionaries had come to teach in boarding schools, but they picked a location where the climate was favorable to a European. Mm-hmm. And because Kilimanjaro, when you live on Kilimanjaro, you're living at a fairly significant elevation, even though it's 5 degrees south of the equator, it's a climate that's hospitable to Europeans.
And you were there for
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
And then you went back to, or then you went to London to study your master's?
Yeah, I taught at girls' boarding school, and I ended up not teaching chemistry for more than a few weeks. I ended up teaching math and English, so then decided that I needed to retrain. And economics had always interested me, so I looked at the prospectus for the London School of Economics, because by then I was engaged to an Englishman, and I saw econometrics and mathematical economics, and I thought, well, I have a background in math. This is probably what will suit me. So I signed up for that. I was accepted. It was academically the most rigorous, most difficult 2 years of my life, but I did survive. I was not the most brilliant student, I can tell you.
And then after that, you came back to Kingston.
I taught for a year in London,
okay,
at a polytechnic, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But living in London, even in the early 70s, was outrageously expensive. And we did want to have a family. And so we decided we'd have to live somewhere other than inner London. Mm-hmm. So we came to Canada, where my parents were, just to suss it out. And my husband got a 3-month contract with St. Lawrence College, and he subsequently retired from the college after working there for 40 years.
40 years.
Mm-hmm. So there was some stability in my life. So we settled here. I, first of all, had a job as a research assistant in the economics department. I then had 2 kids. I got heavily involved in community activism, and so I ended up running for city council.
Before we get to that, I'm looking back on some of the things that you did do, the travels that you participated in. Did any of that sort of give you some sense as to politics being a place you would end up?
No, not really. And if you look at people who are really interested in a career in politics, they're usually associated with a political party. Mm-hmm. And at that time, that wasn't my intro into municipal politics, which tends to be far less partisan to begin with. It was really interest in community change.
Mm-hmm. Why did you run for city council back in 1980?
Because I got heavily involved in local issues. I chaired the Sydenham Board Tenants and Ratepayers Association. I headed the committee to restore the Newlands Pavilion in McDonald Park. Because we had bought an old house in the downtown, a really old house, I became interested in the historic architecture of Kingston in a way I hadn't growing up here. I'd just taken it all for granted. And I became quite good friends with Lois Miller, who was one of the city councillors for the Sydenham Board area, and Lois announced to me one day that she was leaving Kingston, wouldn't be running again. She would help me with a campaign to get elected as a city councillor. And I'd reached a point where my kids were still young, but of an age where I could cope with that. And so it seemed like a great opportunity at the time. And the workings of City Hall were extremely interesting to me.
What was the horseshoe like back 40 years ago when you first came to council?
It's hard to believe it's 40 years. But, I did a presentation for a women's group once and looked at the history of city council. At the time, in 1988, that I was elected, so was Pat Hodge. We were the only two women through the whole 8 years we were subsequently. And there had been a total of 10 women on municipal councils since the earliest days of municipal government in Kingston. So that's literally hundreds of men had been on council. 10 women had been. So it was a pretty rarefied atmosphere.
1988, you ran for mayor.
That's right.
You were elected as the first woman to take on that particular position for the city of Kingston.
Yes.
What was that like? The campaign?
It was. I was still quite young. I had some great support. As far as campaigns go, that I've been involved in either as a supporter or a candidate since, I'd say it was the most energetic, the most fun. And it was a very aspirational time, I think, let alone the fact that we were moving into a period of recession, none of which of us understood at the time. But I look back fondly on that campaign. It was the main contenders were Joe Hawkins, Pat Hodge, and myself, all who'd been on council for a long time, and a general belief, including publicly stated by Mr. Hawkins himself, that because two women were running, he would automatically win. And
that's confidence for you.
Yeah, there were. It was potentially demoralizing in that the Wake Standard ran an editorial saying two women shouldn't be running because they will split the vote, and in other words, we had no identity other than that we were women. Mm-hmm. And I took on one of the editors of the Wake Standard at the time to say, well, would you have categorized two candidates who were Black, two candidates who were Jewish as the sole characteristic of those candidates? To which he was quite horrified at that thought. I was saying, well, why are you doing it to two women? I always, a funny little story, one of the police sergeants at that time was somebody I'd gone to high school with. And I remember running into him at City Hall after I'd been mayor for about 6 months. And he was always a very candid character, all the years I'd known him growing up. And he looked at me and said, well, Helen, things aren't going nearly as badly as a lot of people thought they were going to. So I think, there were clearly doubters. There was a lot of concern. But the cities didn't collapse as a result.
Any particular accomplishments that you can recall that stand out for you during your time as mayor?
Well, I always tease about that too, and saying with especially municipal government, it may well be true for other orders of government as well. The most important accomplishments are probably the least noticed or least interesting. I would say the major accomplishment of my 5 years as mayor was the complete overhaul of the sewer system. And I don't know how one makes that exciting or romantic, but it was absolutely essential. And so we had to raise rate. We put a surcharge on the use of water to be able to do this. And it was right before I was running for re-election. And ergo, at the time that that was Public Utilities Commission recommending it, decided to do this, it was viewed as a form of political suicide. But it wasn't. I got reelected quite easily, and I think people were just really pleased that somebody was doing something. This was after years of the public health unit closing Richardson Beach area every year because the water was too polluted. It was years and years of sewer overflows into the stormwater system. And so it was environmentally one of the most responsible projects I've ever been involved with. And it's a legacy that remains.
I'm going to come back to some of the other things that you did after you left politics, but I want to stay with politics for a second because I think it was 1997 that you were encouraged to run at the federal level.
Yes.
And you were going to run as a PC candidate against Peter Milliken.
Yes.
Who was the Liberal candidate.
And whom I'd known since grade 9.
It's amazing how many people around town that people know forever.
Yeah.
One of the things I was interested in when I was reading this is that you were encouraged to run as a PC candidate by Jean Charest, who was at the time the leader of the Progressive Conservatives, who, as we record this, is now looking at coming back to being the leader of the Conservative Party. What do you think of that as far as he's concerned?
I wish him all the best. He's an excellent prospect as Prime Minister. And if I could say that, I haven't been involved in federal party politics for many, many years. I did not agree with the direction of the what is now the Conservative Party when Peter MacKay, as I capitulated. That left me and many others with no home. And I wish Monsieur Charest all the very best in terms of resuscitating what was a much more balanced, intelligent, sensible politics. But the schism in the country is seemingly ever deeper in that respect. So he has a major task ahead of him.
What do you think of all of this polarization in the country? And it's not just our country. You know, the States is a good example of another country that's very polarized. How do you get past all that?
I look to, Canada's never as dramatic in its politics as the United States, but it very often mimics it. I saw a presentation by a gentleman from the Pew Research Center in Washington a few years ago that I think was highly predictive of what we're experiencing now. And it's a huge schism between change and those who want it and those who cannot accept it. And I won't say more than that because we tend to try to characterize people and put them in boxes, but he predicted very clearly the schism, the divide between Republican and Democrat, but it's also the schism between old and young. And I couldn't help but read an article this morning about the Academy Awards presentation and think how nothing could show more dramatically the difference between emerging social attitudes and that of the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate querying the latest potential judicial appointment by Biden. I mean, it's like worlds and worlds apart in terms of socially progressive attitudes.
Which part of the Academy Awards are you talking about?
That a gay black woman wins a major award and is announcing that this is a first and how thrilling it is for her and all around her. And looking at the Republican senators having queried Judge Jackson as to a promoter of child pornography.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
But it's exactly the schism that this man predicted. One of the most interesting things he said was a a bellwether of the direction of American politics is the advertisements for the Super Bowl. And that's when major advertisers are pushing buttons to see how far they can get. Mm-hmm. So what you will see is ads with mixed interracial marriage, with gay couples. They're testing to see how far they can get with them. And then what happens is 2 or 3 years later, you start seeing them on regular television programming.
Yeah.
So what's happening here is all this coming. If every time I don't watch much commercial television, but when I do, I see these ads and think, my God, how can a whole section of American and Canadian society be dealing with this? Mm-hmm. They're not dealing well with it.
Yeah, right. Let's get back to tracking your history for a second. And after you left politics, you got involved in different organizations, and I've sort of compiled a little list of them here. So there were 3 years as chair of the Ontario Municipal Board.
Yes.
And then president of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, member of the Premier's Council on Health Strategy, member of the Ontario Roundtable on Environment and Economy, member of the Advisory Council of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization from 2001 to 2006. So some of these would be volunteer, they all paid positions?
My involvement with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario happened throughout my time on council. And so working with the association, it's just a lobby organization for municipal government, working primarily with the provincial government. So I did that as long as I was in municipal politics. I then agreed to chair the Ontario Municipal Board for 3 years. It was at the time of the NDP government. Bob Rae was the premier. Then halfway through my term, Mike Harris got elected, and he made decisions, which is not atypical, that he wanted his own people in those jobs, especially as that's one of the more prominent political appointments. And then, the other things you mentioned there, like the Roundtable on Environment and Economy and the Premier's Health Council. I was first appointed the Premier's Health Council when David Peterson was the Premier. It had already started, but had decided that there was no municipal representation and there should be. And at the Premier's Council, I met some of the most fascinating people I've ever met in my life. Fraser Mustard being one of them, who's had a profound influence on my thought process ever since. Another person who served on the Premier's Council, the later council when Bob Rae took it over, was Duncan Sinclair at Queen's University, for whom Duncan is one of my heroes. And the Roundtable on Environment and Economy was also an initiative of the Rae government. And again, I was a municipal representative. It was always those jobs, or they weren't jobs, they were appointments, not paying appointments, were the kind of icing on the cake for me in terms of seeing a bigger world. But it meant I could never put those ahead of doing my job as a mayor. So I always made sure I put the meetings I had to go to here first and foremost, and the business I had to deal with. But it usually meant I used to find after evening meetings that I tended to be wide awake for quite a while afterwards, regurgitating all that had occurred. And so that's when I would get in the car and drive to Toronto. I wouldn't wait till the next morning. And it worked. I always managed to get there.
John Garretson tells the story of driving from Kingston to Toronto when he was in the provincial government, and driving his driver crazy because he insisted on all of his Elvis Presley cassettes being played during the whole trip, back and forth. So,
I didn't have a driver.
In 2006, you went to work for the provincial government as a manager in the Ministry of Community and Social Services.
Yes, I started in the regional office in Kingston. I was working in children's services, again, because I had been started off as the program coordinator for the early years programs. The thrust of all of this had come from Fraser Mustard. So I was a disciple of Fraser Mustard and quite happy to do this. I then moved into a management job in Toronto, but I was working in adult developmental services, about which I knew nothing. Another huge learning curve for me. But I did that for 10 years, which is the longest I've ever stuck with anything. And then I retired.
So you retired in 2014, and this takes us to Helen Traveling 2.0, where you wanted to get out there and visit. And what I read was one of your goals was to try to do a large segment of Route 66.
Yeah. Well, COVID hasn't helped.
Now, my question, was that going to involve a little red convertible?
No. I have to make some concessions to the person who travels with me, who, as an English person, has said he's never understood the North American obsession with the automobile. His family never owned a car, right? He grew up in highly populated South Lancashire. We've managed Chicago to Oklahoma City. We still have the second half to do, but...
I was watching a streaming service one day, and they were featuring the program, the original TV show. So I'm assuming it's a red convertible because the show was in black and white. So it just looked like a red convertible.
Well, it's the kind of thing that you would expect,
It's interesting to look back at some of these old TV shows that you haven't watched in 50 years and see what they were like. You and I were talking about this before we started recording, and that's the whole business of volunteerism.
Yeah.
The business of continuing to do it even after we've retired. I mean, and you and I share that in common. It's something that in my case keeps my brain working, and it also helps out the community that I live in. The Queen's School of Policy Studies is something that you were involved with, and I was reading an article that was published back in January of 2021 where you and a master's student whose name I have written down here somewhere, Samantha Kiefer, wrote this white paper on the relationship, and I think most of it seemed to be on the financial relationship between municipalities, provincial governments, and federal governments, and how that money is raised and spent. Is that a fair, very generalized?
Well,
I know
it's a part of it. What I had been asked to do, and Samantha was a graduating MPA student. She's now working in a full-time job in Ottawa, is to look at the municipal response to the first wave of COVID. And the Kingston case study was particularly interesting because there had been far less of a first wave here than there had been anywhere else in the province. And it was, I leaned heavily on the Whig Standard that had done an exhaustive set of reports on how people had foreseen the problem that was approaching us of the pandemic and how subsequently had dealt with it locally. And Kingston, being so well endowed with medical facilities, had certain resources as well as an extremely talented medical officer of health. But again, his connections were interwoven with infection control at the hospital and so on. So we were extremely well served, and I wrote that up. But to do the background for that paper, it was necessary to look at the role of municipalities and to look at the role of public health and who governs it. And so I went through this looking at a declaration of emergency, what the powers of a mayor are, what the powers of other municipal officials are, because a lot of these, you had to blow the dust off the cover of these manuals. It being the first pandemic, most of us in our lifetimes had any real, to the extent it spread, that we had any familiarity. So I wrote that, but then I couldn't help but look at the financial cost to municipalities. You will see it repeated that its transportation costs were what really suffered through this whole exercise, because people stopped taking public transit and it's never come back again. It's been a massive issue for Toronto, an important issue for Ottawa as well. The bigger the city, the more important the issue. And so looking at municipal finance, and which leads me always to my favorite topic, or one of them, is how we raise revenue as municipalities for a huge plethora of services that have got nothing to do with service to property. So the whole tax system has for many, many years been completely distorted, and it doesn't service any of us well that this continues to endure.
When you are looking at the regular voter who is going into a voting booth later this year at the municipal level and at the provincial level as well, when you are talking about issues like this, and I would expect that for a lot of us it's hard to understand the ramifications or the suggestions or the thought processes and how we realign the tax system, as a for instance, at the municipal level. What's the message to the regular voter and how to deal with this when they are looking at candidates who are coming forward?
I don't know. It's really difficult. I worked with a couple of people years ago at the University of Waterloo. I spent the fall term in the planning school at the University of Waterloo right after I left as OMB chair. And three of us worked on a project to say, if we had the whole map of Canada with the same population that we have now and the population projections we have now, how would we design political boundaries? Well, they would not bear any relation to the political boundaries we currently have. First of all, from Canada being in the mid-1800s a virtually completely agrarian society. Kingston was one of the biggest cities. It was bigger than what was then York, now Toronto. We're talking about just a few thousand people, and the rest living in the countryside and in villages. We're now one of the most intensely urban countries in the world. And so we have agrarian political boundaries for an urban nation. But how we change that, I have no idea. I mean, maybe it just explodes at some point. But we have a constitution in place that we know is ironclad. No province wants to reopen it. So we continue to muddle along as best we can with a fractured political structure.
Let's bring it right down to Kingston, literally right to the downtown of Kingston, when you were talking about us being more of an urban city than we ever have been. And the program that City Hall seems to be promoting now, which they call downtown intensification, I think is the word that they use, by putting a big apartment building so more people will move downtown. And this is me interpreting it. So more people move downtown, you don't need as many vehicles because everything's right there and you can walk to wherever you need to go to. Your thoughts on this whole business of intensification?
Well, it's right that the more people living downtown, that's what will sustain
the downtown.
A downtown. Yeah. And that's been the case for years and years. That's not various ideas over the years. One of my favorite programs from years ago was giving interest-free loans to property owners to develop upper floors of commercial buildings on the main streets, which was very successfully done and actually continues to be done. That's not the debate. Mm-hmm. The debate is the building form. And what kind of environment does one want to achieve in the end of a whole bunch of new residential structures?
And how high do you want to go?
Well, height is a critical factor. Yeah. It's not height alone. It's bulk that's even more critical an issue than height, I think.
Mm-hmm. Lots of issues to look at as we work our way towards that election coming up. The other thing I wanted to sort of touch on, because I saw that you were involved in it, and I guess I sort of gravitated towards it because I am a senior citizen as well, and I'm looking at this thing.
Well, you haven't aged at all, David. We haven't seen each other for quite some time. But, oh, yeah.
Oasis is an outfit that you're involved with, and I had not heard of it until I saw your name associated with it. And I guess what I'm comparing it to is something like a senior citizen center. Now, what does Oasis do?
No, this is well, and the senior center is wonderful. I use its services. I'm an avid pickleball player, and
another one of those.
They
keep running up. Yeah.
Yes.
Jeez.
Again, it gets back to the Canadian demographic and what we all need to understand about what's happening around us, i.e., we do hear it repeatedly now. We are an aging society. We had the biggest and longest baby boom in the world, and the head of the baby boom is now 75 years old, which is, by the definition often of the medical profession, the entrance to old age. The fastest growing population segment in our country is people over 90. So we need to all entrench this in our brains. Mm-hmm. And so that gets us to the how do we cope with this as a society? And I would argue that currently we're not doing it particularly well. So what basic principles do we need to know to cope as best we can? The people who maintain relationships well throughout their lives, who get out and do things and enjoy the company of other people, are the people who are likely to live longer, healthier lives, an emphasis on healthier. And so it's in the interests of an overstressed medical system and the rest of us who want to be able to enjoy life as long as possible that we encourage socialization amongst people. One of the huge tragedies of old age in our community is the number of isolated, lonely people. And that's a prescription for ill health. Mm-hmm. So Oasis is just one small program that's trying to address this. I would say it's a primary prevention program. It, of course, has suffered from the effects of COVID, but I would also argue it's been a very useful service during COVID for preventing our isolation to the extent that other people in similar circumstances have experienced it. It's in one apartment building in Kingston. It's a program to encourage socialization, nutrition, and physical exercise. And it's a private landlord, Homestead Land Holdings, which we all know in Kingston very well, and which is a very large landlord across the country now, who is very supportive of the program. So they provide the space for congregate activity. And the original Oasis has had a annual transfer from the Ministry of Health every year to be able to afford to pay a program coordinator who's the glue that keeps the whole thing together. We have a partnership with Providence Care, who does our financial management and who hires the program coordinator. And we have a volunteer board of directors who are knowledgeable community volunteers. There's 7 of us. Mm-hmm. And we are the ones who liaise with the landlord, with Providence Care, and the onus on us as a board is to maintain the spirit of Oasis. And the spirit of Oasis is that just because people turn a certain age doesn't mean they left their brains somewhere on the doorstep. That they have certain desires, certain needs, certain wants, that we encourage them to project those, that we offer as best we can the programming which best suits them. The program coordinator also has a very important role as a confidant. And although she doesn't perform what I would call home care services, she's able to direct people to the best services they may need. Mm-hmm. We have formed an extremely important relationship with 2 Queen's professors in the School of Rehabilitation Therapy, who are wonderful people and for whom I am forever grateful, who have expanded this into a major research project and have opened sites with colleagues at Western and McMaster in several locations across Ontario and 2 locations in Vancouver. And so they're running a comprehensive evaluation. Their preliminary findings are very hopeful. That we are, if not preventing people entirely from entering long-term care, we're certainly postponing it, mm-hmm. Which is what everybody wants. If you ask any older person, do they want to go to long-term care, the answer is no. And we're also doing things like falls prevention, which we're seeing fewer falls in these folks. Our professor friends are showing that there are fewer visits to emergency. So, in other words, we're affecting the whole healthcare system. Mm-hmm. And it's just so obvious once you get involved in it. But we're, as a society, haven't been very good at launching and sustaining simple prevention programs. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those.
So this is just available in the building that you're in right now?
Well, except that through the research project, it is expanding to some other buildings. There are 3 other buildings in Kingston, 1 in Belleville, 2 or 3 in London, 1 in Hamilton, 1 in Toronto. Well, it's huge. It's 2 buildings in Toronto. So we're hoping through the next 3 years of research that we can present as favorable a case as we possibly can to both the federal and the provincial governments, that extending and supporting this program is highly viable and makes a huge amount of sense. I've looked at the financial officers' reports for the Ontario budget. The current government is rebuilding approximately 30,000 long-term care beds, is promising to build 30,000 new long-term care beds within the next 3 to 4 years. At the end of that exercise, the wait lists for long-term care, as if we continue the practices we do now, will be equally as long then as they are now. Mm-hmm. In other words, we're just treading water at huge expense.
Yeah. I can see that brain's continuing to work and continuing to come up with ideas, and it's good to see.
Well, and you see, the person who got me into this was Judith McKenzie, who was a city councillor in Kingston in the 1970s. Judith hasn't given up either, obviously.
Well, I think I served on a committee with her way back when, at some particular point. I've had a great deal of fun talking with you today, and I wish you nothing but the best, and I thank you very much for the time that you've given us.
Okay, David, thanks very much.
My thanks once again to Helen Cooper, former mayor of the City of Kingston. This episode was recorded in March 2022.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.